Today I would like to talk to you about longarm quilting tools that I use in my studio. Of course, the main one is my Gamel. I bought my Gamel spring of 2004, and it took me about a 6-month learning curve to learn how to thread it, mess around with it. I would put lots of muslin quilt tops on and quilt with it, but that's my main big tool, is my Gamel. And right here, I had to learn how to maintain my own machine. Saves time, saves money. When I bought my machine, the town that I lived in did not have a dealer, so it meant me throwing this whole head, what we would call the head of the machine, into the back of my car and taking it down to Salt Lake City. That got expensive, it got time consuming, so I kind of learned how to do a lot of my own maintenance. But my favorite tool that not many longarm people know about, and I do not know if this is true with APQS, Nolting, any of the other longarm HQ16s, any of the other longarm machines out there, but once or twice a month I reverse the polarity of my machine, of my motor to be exact, so that it gets, most of the time oil is going this way. The drive is from the back to the front, or from what we would call the back of the machine to the front. But I stick this, it's kind of, it's just I don't know the mechanical parts of it, but I plug it in here and it reverses the polarity of the engine, of the motor, and I let it run backwards so that the oil, it reverses the polarity so it runs this way. The drive runs towards the back of the machine, and it gets oil back in here and back in the back part of the machine. I did not know about this little thing until I went to a quilt retreat, and somebody told me about it, and I invested in one, and I really think that's one reason why I've not had as many breakdowns as I've had in the past. But I just reverse the polarity, I oil up my machine really good, and then I just let it run for about 10 or 15 minutes. You know, maybe while I'm loading a quilt or pinning a quilt to zippers. One of my favorite tools. Of course, there's the basic rulers. One of my favorite is a paint stick. It's pretty soft. I'm not going to tell you it's perfect, but you kind of have to watch to get a straight edge. A paint ruler is good. And your constant different size circles. I have a small clamshell and a chevron. Right here on the back, you can see this. They're sticky sandpaper, so that when your ruler is sitting on top of your quilt, it doesn't slide all over the place. Just some different rulers, one of my favorite tools. Of course, we all have these probably. The standard metal magnetic pin cushions. They're just a parts bowl basically that has a magnet on the bottom. I have two types of tension gauges. I have a TOA. You put your bobbin in here with the bobbin case and wrap it around and pull on it, and it will give you the tension that you have. I like to run mine between 20 and 25 by thread. This is another one. It's not as accurate, I do not think, but nevertheless it will do in a pinch if I can't find this one, or luckily I've never dropped this because that would throw out the calibration. Of course, oil, screwdriver. I oil my machine before the beginning of every time when I turn it on, and then if I run it all day, probably midday, I will give it a good oil too. Small little tweezers. Let me see if I can put this against my black sweater. They have just enough of a point on them, I'd like to say, that for getting out lint or thread out of places that's broken off maybe in my machine. The extended base, so that when we are working with rulers, we have a flat base in which to put them on underneath the quilt, so you've got some extra room to work. I do not leave my extended base on all the time. It definitely comes off when I'm not using rulers. I have my favorite little pair of snips. They're curved. I don't know if you can see this against my shirt. They're curved and they're spring loaded, maybe just by design. But they're curved so they do not cut the quilt top. I don't know if you can see that. I have various needles, and that is a topic in itself. When I taught down at the Quilt Crossing, different needle sizes do different things with your machine. I generally use a 3.5 or a 4. Very seldom do I use a 5.0, but I always have lots of needles on hand. And then one of my very favorite things is a coffee filter. And I don't think you can see it on camera. It's sitting up here at the front of my machine, but I poke a hole in this, the very bottom, and I mount it on my stem on the top. And this is what I use to throw my threads in as I'm quilting. That way I'm not constantly throwing them on the floor. They're not getting jammed up in my vacuum cleaner. And right now, as you can see, let me see if I can take this off. Well, I ripped it, but I'll show it to you anyway. See, it's full of thread, lots of thread snippets. In the winter, I throw them out, or fall even, I throw them out for the birds, and I do see them, especially the really wild colors, the pinks, the purples, the blues, colors that you wouldn't generally find in nature. I see them in birds' nests around. The last thing that I kind of want to touch on, I have a full-length mirror here on the bed of my machine, and that is so I can see underneath the quilt, see if my tension is right. I am the kind of quilter that I like my bobbin thread to be lighter weight than my top thread. The bobbin thread to me is almost the most important, because people, what do when they get their quilt back, is they turn it over to look at the bottom of the quilt to see the quality of the stitches. And the top thread, I like to use King Tut. The bottom thread, I like to use So Fine. King Tut is a variegated, and they even make solid colors now. Thread is a whole science in itself, and especially running them through these industrial machines. The best advice I can give you is find two that you like, stick with them. I shy away completely from metallics. I don't do a lot of metallic thread through my machine. I just personally don't like the way it looks, even for Christmas, for holiday placemats or whatever. And I stay away from monofilament. Monofilament is all polyester, and if you start washing and drying that quilt, you know that's just going to melt, and it's not obviously good for your quilt to have melted thread. The last thing I wanted to touch on was the thread that I use. I have a couple here. Here's the So Fine from Superior. I just like the quality of this on the back of my quilts. And running a close second is now a thread from Connecting Threads. They're out of Portland, I believe. And it's just their Essential Pro for quilters, for long arm quilters, not domestic machines. My long arm machine is a Gamble. My domestic sewing machine is a Bernina. I will never switch. I will never switch those two constants in my life. My Bernina is fairly new, and my Gamble is, I don't think it's that old. But this thread works good in both of my machines. And then the King Tut, this is a variegated, I believe it's called, don't have my glasses on. Yeah, I can't read that. But it's like a variegated green. But as you can see, I have lots of colors. And I try to match the color of my customer's quilt with the type of thread that I'm using. It's kind of in my family that I paint with thread. Thread can, the thicknesses, the different weights, the different textures, the different variegated versus non-variegated, it can change drastically if you use one thread over another on a quilt top along with the quilting design. My favorite though is Superior. This I don't run through my Bernina. This I run through my Bernina, and the connecting threads Essential Pro I run through my Bernina. I don't get a whole lot of time to piece for myself. I'm too busy quilting the quilts that customers bring me. My craft, or my art, I guess you could say, is rare in that I start with something, I finish with something that somebody else started. My customer will bring me the quilt top that they have already pieced. I get them by the mail. I pick them up when I'm in Boise. I have a clientele here in the small community where I live in Idaho, and they come and I have to quilt them, sometimes bind them, most of the time just quilt them and send them back, and then my client finishes their own quilt with the binding. But that's a whole nother discussion in itself too, because sometimes quilts aren't square. I have been very fortunate in that I love most of my clients' work. They quilt square. They lay good on my machine. I'm not constantly fighting with wavy borders that are a long-arm quilter's nightmare. Unsquare quilts don't quilt up as well, although I can quilt them square. If I know that they're off a little bit, I can start at the top and quilt a square, a quilt square. That is not uncommon in my industry to learn how to do, to be a fairly decent quilter. Anyway, that's it for my tools of the trade. There's lots of other ones. I use masking tape a lot to mark my panto edges versus custom quilting. That's another topic. It's kind of like working with different mediums, the different types of quilting that you can put on a quilt. The quilts behind me are all mine, and I have others over here that I'm looking at. I experiment on my own quilts a lot, whether it's custom, whether it's a panto, and that way I learn how that quilt is, or the quilting type of quilting is going to come out on my customer's quilt. Lots of different types of quilting that I like to experiment with and do on my own quilts. So anyway, hope you found this helpful, and thank you for watching, and have a great day.